Hello and well met. This is Founder Leland with Fantasy Grounds Academy. Today I'm going to go through some things that are going to be something that you'll come across when you use the Fantasy Grounds Unity platform. This is an unscripted show, so there are no plans or agendas here. So everything you see here is true to the rule set. There's no lollygagging, hooly bopping, anything like that. This is all just a kind of a basic overview and some things that you should keep in mind about Fantasy Grounds. So there are some things that I think that some game masters might run into, or even players. So when you're getting ready to start a game, quite often it can be a daunting task to build characters right before a game. So it would behoove one to either purchase a Pregen pack, which you can find on the DM's Guild. You can find free ones on the Fantasy Grounds forums, and you might be able to export or import some from other campaigns within Fantasy Grounds. But you can make a set of Pregens, so I'm going to show you what that looks like. So I have two modules loaded here. One is a generic Pregens that I made for pretty much any game. All of these characters are D&D 3rd level. And then I remade the Lost Mine of Fandelver characters to my own liking. I kept most of the stats and such the same, but I wanted to add stuff to this so that it was easier for me when we actually started playing. So the Pregen modules are not very common. You'll find them in Lost Mine of Fandelver. You'll find them in the starter box set for the I believe the D&D Essentials might have it, and then also the Stranger Things box set. Most other modules do not come with Pregens. They assume you're either going to bring in your own or create your own. But if you don't have time for that, it is nice to have a set of characters that are ready to go in case you want to play a one-shot or you want to show somebody how Fantasy Grounds works, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. So I have two modules here. I'm just going to load my generic ones. I call it FGC Pregens. I just gave it that title, Pregens 1. Pre-generated characters are basically created in Fantasy Grounds. Once they're done, you can export this as a module. And when you do so, you would select the Pregens option on the export. So when you load this module up again, those characters will be available. Now, they don't show up in your campaign right away, so if I go to characters, they're not there. So that's because I haven't brought them over yet. So you can import them through the interface with the import tool, which is this blue import button. When you click on that, it will take you to a pool of characters that you may have already created in the past. If you're just starting with Fantasy Grounds, you won't have a pool of characters, but this is just in case you have things already built in Fantasy Grounds and you want to bring those in. Now, they are rule set specific, so if you have a Pathfinder character, you're not going to be able to import it into a D&D campaign. Nonetheless, you can do that across all the different types of networks. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. The next thing is when you do have Pregens, if you click on the Pregens section, which is only accessible through the library, so there's no shortcut on the right for Pregens. You have to access it through the library or import it manually through the character selection window. So I'm going to click on this Pregen area, and when I have this, when I give him the get all this set up, then I'm going to add these to the campaign. So there's quite a few here. I think I have like 8 of them or something like that. Let's see. There's 12. So I gave a pretty good variety of things. So I have Centaurus. He is a centaur fighter. I have Dorag Weirdbeard Rockfist, who is the cleric. And then I have the Druid Wildshape PC, which is a druid, and then I have Figano Fetch, and he is basically a kind of a rogue, kind of typical burglar type. I have Leyren Half-Elf Ranger, Lord Gallimar is a paladin. Namita is a kind of more of a rogue assassin type, more athletic and that sort of thing. Shayra is a female elf sorceress. I have Squire Valius, who is basically the henchman of Lord Gallimar and his right-hand man. Think of like Batman and Robin kind of thing. Tristal Relk is a 3rd level druid. There's Zamas, who is a barbarian, 3rd level. And then there's Zayla Trusong, who's a female half-elf bard. So when I click on these little green buttons over here, it's adding it to the pool of characters that'll be available for the campaign. Now, you don't have to add all these. You can just add the ones you want. This gives the players a pretty good selection of and variety of characters to play. You can't potentially, create every little single iteration with every combination. It's been done before. If you purchase one of the modules on the DM skill, if Rob 2E's done one where it has most of the different combinations. So that's something that you might want to look at if you're planning on running a lot of one-shots, especially if you're like Adventure League. You can make a bunch of Adventure League legal characters if you want. But this is a basic import function in Fantasy Grounds. So you can add them from the Pregen panel, and you can also add them from the different various campaigns that you have in your modules. So if I click this blue plus button, it's going to open up the back end of Fantasy Grounds. So it's going to course through all the libraries that I have and search for any and all characters that are made for this rule set. So if you have another game that you're running and you want to pull in a different character from there, you can do so with the blue import button on the bottom of the character selection tool. And what you'll get is a list of different characters that are created and available in different campaigns. So here's the import character dialog box. It's kind of similar to the Pregen thing. And then you would just go through here and click this green plus button to add them to your pool of available characters. One issue I see already is that a lot of these don't have names and they're not really detailed well enough. So it's going to be hard for me to tell which ones specifically I want to bring over. So that's something to keep in mind when you're naming your characters. Make sure you give them a name that you'll remember, like Sterling here. I remember him. But if you have this name with no name and then you have like just hardly any details, it's going to be hard to tell which is which. So try to name your characters aptly as required. Now the next thing is to have your game master will make these available for you if you're a player, or if you are the game master, you'll have them for your players to select. So this is a handy way to get people into the game quicker, and it also allows for you to manage characters at different levels. So you can make a campaign that you only create characters in, and then import them into one of your games, so that way you're not you having to load 50,000 books and that sort of thing. So there's ways to kind of make things more, how should I say, more potentially easier to use and also more efficient. So for instance, I'm going to click on Centaurus. He already has a token. That's something I did by design. And these are paid tokens that I got from Bernardo Hasselman. Normally you don't have that right off the bat. And then if you click on the portrait, you can bring up the portraits area in Fantasy Grounds. And there's some fantasy portraits that come with it. And there's a thing called FG Fantasy, which has a lot of the different tropes and types of portrait photos that you're going to potentially have to choose from. Usually, if you don't have a token, your portrait becomes your token. And that's something that you would want to look at when you're creating your character, is that as a player, you don't get to select the tokens, but if you have a portrait, it will become your default token if you don't already have one. So I'm going to look in here. I don't think there's really a specific thing for a centaur, but I'm going to look for kind of like a humanoid look and just kind of use that. So I'll just use this human male dreads thing. That's pretty close to what he looks like. So if I double click that, that'll add it to the character, and it also adds it over here to the character selection window. So you have a portrait. And basically, it just allows you to bring in your characters a lot quicker without having to deal with building everything at one shot. So you take the time beforehand, and then when you're done with your collection, if you want to make a collection, you would create the characters and organize them. Let me look at the story entry and see what I did with these. So yeah, I have a Pregen pack, and I made a couple story entries here. So this kind of gives you the breakdown. So we have Leyran, Centarius, Tristal. So I kind of made myself a little legend so I can remember. So the first three characters were Leyran, Centarius, and Tristal Relk. Namita and Zamas came later, and then Shayra, Lord Galamar, and Squire Valius came after that, and then after all that came Zayla, Figan, and Dorig. So they all kind of showed up at different times in the adventuring party, and they became friends. And they're kind of like an adventuring group now. There's 12 of them. So they usually run in packs of 4 to 6, and it just depends on the situation. But I kind of made a variety here so that people can have a choice. And then I put a little note here that these were based on some personal experiences with these particular characters that I had grown to love and play over the years as a DM and a player. So I kind of modeled these after character sheets that I had left over from older iterations of D&D, and I turned those into 5th edition characters for the rule set. So you got some martial types of spellcasters and rogues. So these are kind of a breakdown of why I did this, so I have an idea of what characters are what, and I can share this with my players and say, okay, these are your choices. And so that's kind of what this Pregen module does. So on the export function, I'm just going to pretend like I'm going to export the module. So in the chat window, you do a /export. It's going to allow us to create a module, provided that we have everything set and ready to go. And that means, all the characters are built, and if you want to add some story entries, you can. But in here is a pre-generated characters option that you need to have selected at the minimum. And then in this case, I also have a couple story items to kind of detail them a little bit more. And that's pretty much all you'd have to do. And then if you had tokens that you wanted to associate them with, like what I have here, you would drag those loose ones from your assets. You can't use ones from modules. You have to use ones that you've created or that you purchased or whatever. And you would drag them in this exported tokens area. And of course, you'd make sure they're assigned to a character sheet. And when you export it, it will automatically assign the token to that character if you want that. You could just drag some loose ones in here and just make them available so that you can drag them manually after the fact, but this is already set. So that's basically how you make a pre-gen character module, is just build all your characters first or organize them. Make sure they're titled correctly. So sometimes you might want to put the rule set in front of it, or you might put level 3 or something like that to help you in the navigation window where the character selection is. The other thing you can do with characters is you can import and export them. So if you wanted to export Centarius here, you could essentially click the edit list, and there's a blue drop down, and you can export this XML file as a file that you can import in a different session. So you can import individual characters, or you can export individual characters, or you can use the ones that are internal to the game. So if you wanted to send this to another table or another game master, you could. It does not consider the artwork, so even though I have tokens assigned to this, it's not going to send the token or the portrait. So that information will still be blank. So if I export this character and re-import it in a different campaign, those will not show up unless I have the module loaded. So that's just something you want to keep in mind with. So artwork normally doesn't export. So that's something in Fantasy Grounds that you'll learn, is that any maps or anything that's part of a campaign or that's embedded in a module, normally the artwork will not be exported. So just kind of give you a heads up on that. So that's basically how you would manage your characters. And then, of course, we have the character wizard, which is something that is fairly new to this rule set. If you play Pathfinder 2, it already has one nice one built into it that's kind of grown with the rule set. The character wizard allows you to build a character without making any of the initial commitments, and then you would save it. However, once you save it, you're pretty much stuck with that character. Whereas if you build it manually, each time you drag one of these elements over, you're committed. So you don't have any way to resituate or switch it around. And the character wizard helps with that. It does speed up character creation anywhere from 10 to 20 minutes, depending on how complex your character is. It does allow for things where you don't double up on certain skills. So if you're doing a character build and they have some skills that are in common, this helps eliminate that problem, because if you do it manually, you have a small chance of overlap on your skills, and Fantasy Grounds won't tell you anything. But if you use the character wizard, it helps with that. So there's some things that are good and beneficial about the character wizard, and then the other things about it is it has to be updated whenever a new rule book comes out. They have to test it and see if it works, and there's some little bugs that need to be worked out right now. So if you're using it, it works great with the standard content, the player's handbook, the regular content. Anything beyond Tasha's starts to get a little bit weird because of the coding and such is changing. And then also you want to avoid homebrew stuff if you can, because it does not recognize a lot of the homebrew content. So if you've made a custom class, this wizard won't necessarily pick it up properly. So a lot of it has to do with how you have it formatted. So, but those are the drawbacks: is that it doesn't work too well on homebrew, and it doesn't necessarily take into account the newer changes that Wizards of the Coast is putting down for characters. So that will evolve in time if it hasn't already. I haven't worked on it in a while, but about a month ago I was building a bunch of characters with the wizard, and I decided to wait until Smiteworks had a chance to get caught up and do some more editing and work on it. I know they've done a little bit, but I'm not sure where they're at on it. So those are your different things for characters. So you can manage characters, you can build characters, you can also import them and export them. You can create Pregen modules. So there's a lot of different avenues that you have for characters. So the old character manager that came with Fantasy Grounds Classic has been retired. So if you're used to that, that feature's gone away. It's now called kind of all internal now. A lot of the third-party character builders do not work with Fantasy Grounds unless you've created an extension or some sort of program to convert it. There are a few attempts out there to make character builders for Fantasy Grounds, and then you import the XML file. A lot of those break pretty often, and they don't have the newer content up to date. So you're kind of doing that at your own risk. A lot of people have asked for Hero Labs. There used to be compatibility between Hero Labs and Fantasy Grounds a long time ago. I don't think it was ever maintained or kept going, and it doesn't work that I know of unless someone's updated it. There used to be a utility with Classic. I don't even think Unity has that anymore. So there's that. A lot of people will use like D&D Beyond to plan their character and then build it in Fantasy Grounds. That's usually what they'll do, or they'll just have a pen and paper character and they'll just input the information. Generally, if you know what you're doing and you have a lot of the details, it cuts down a little bit on the character creation time. However, when you start adding custom coding and customized things to your characters, it can take a lot longer. So if you're spending more than an hour on your character, that's a lot of work. So so make some things happen for yourself and your group. So make some pre-gens. Make sure the characters are built correctly, because that'll help you in the long run as a game master and a player. And then also realize that you have options in Fantasy Grounds to import, export, and to create pre-gens and even export them as a module so you can use them over and over and over. And that's basically what I did, is I made my own pre-gens and exported them. So there are things that you can do to help you with with Fantasy Grounds, and to manage characters in Fantasy Grounds can be a little daunting and a little bit annoying at times. And just remember that Fantasy Grounds initially was not created to be a character builder. It was mainly to manage campaigns. So the character part of it kind of came along later. It wasn't as I guess it wasn't as focused on when they first developed the platform. So when SmiteWorks took it over, they've obviously added a lot of functionality to character building, but it's not a bona fide character builder like Hero Labs or something you'd find online. They don't have a character mancer or whatever they call it on Roll20, but they do have a way to build characters, to manage them, and to edit them, and also to customize them. So there is that functionality, but just keep in mind that this platform is not inherently a character builder. It is for managing campaigns. So anyway, so that's pretty much all I have for today. Happy Thanksgiving, and I hope that this helps you as a game master and a player. Done plenty of videos about building characters. I've done plenty about editing and making custom characters. I thought I would revisit this character import, export, and management part of Fantasy Grounds. I haven't done anything like that in a long time. So it's still fairly similar to Classic, except for you don't have the character manager group. And then you are able to use the character wizard instead of building characters manually, which is, a preference thing. I prefer to build them manually because if anything goes wrong, I'll be able to tell right away. Whereas the character builder kind of takes that visibility away from you, especially if you don't know the rule set or the platform yet. So anyhow, happy Thanksgiving if you celebrate it. Take care, everyone. Have a great holiday, and I hope